In an unpredictable world, you can't simply wait for change to happen. We created McKinsey Live for leaders like you. Our global experts break down the need to know on the issues that matter most to decision makers and to society. We'll introduce you to leading research, new and transformational ideas, and practical knowledge and strategies, all to empower the changemakers of today, enabling you to step forward boldly, tackle real challenges, and drive change with clarity and purpose. We're helping you take control so you can drive the conversation, so you can lead fearlessly while leaving no one behind, so you can take the reins to create and accelerate growth, so you can build resilience for the future. Together, we can push towards the opportunities of our era. Let's get started now.
Hello and welcome to McKinsey Live. I'm Lucia Rahili, McKinsey's editorial director and your host for today's event, Unlocking Growth, the Power of CEO, CMO, and CFO Alignment. As always, this series of live events is designed to bring you closer to our leaders and their research on some of the most pressing issues shaping business and the global economy. We do aim to make these events as interactive as we can, so please feel free to use the Q&A functionality, and we will at least try to answer a selection of your questions as time allows. Joining us today, just back from a foray to the French Riviera for Cannes Lions, are two of our senior partners and marketing experts, Kelsey Robinson and Shelley Stewart III. Kelsey is based in Boston, and she leads our marketing practice, working with consumer-facing brands to drive sustainable top-line growth. Her work spans customer analytics, omni-channel strategy, digital marketing, customer acquisition, and more. And Shelley is based in New York. He serves clients across a range of sectors, including private capital, advanced industries, telecoms, media, and technology. Shelley is also the global leader of McKinsey's reputation and engagement function, and he chairs the McKinsey Institute for Economic Mobility, which is effectively our think tank focused on building a more inclusive economy through cross-sector collaboration. Kelsey and Shelley, welcome back to McKinsey Live. It's so great to see both of you, and thanks for making the time to talk with us today.
Thanks for having us, Lucia.
Thank you, Lucia.
So let's get rolling. Obviously, the current global business climate is rife with uncertainty in a range of ways, macroeconomically, geopolitically, technologically, given the advent of Gen AI and now agentic AI. And amid all this change and volatility, growth continues obviously to be imperative, but it also risks being elusive for some organizations. We just released some new research at Cannes Lions on how to reignite growth successfully, in particular by homing in on the relationship between the CMO, the CEO, and the CFO, and harnessing the power of that partnership. Shelley, again, you were on the ground at Cannes and shared that research with a number of CEOs and other executives. Talk to us a bit about the vibe at Cannes and also how the research was received and some of the key takeaways that resonated with the folks whom you spoke to, just high level, if you would.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lucia, and thank you for having me. Look, the energy on the ground at Cannes was incredible, and I had the privilege of sharing this research across a number of different panel formats, and it really did stimulate a really healthy and robust discussion. Let me start with where you started, which is leaders, CEOs, they are navigating a incredibly dynamic and complex set of situations. You talked about the rapid rise of generative AI, and that's impacting all industries, all areas of all businesses. And so people are just trying to get their arms around that. Second is obviously geopolitical uncertainty. There's all sorts of stuff going on in the world that has implications for our clients, and folks are really trying to get their arms around what it means for them today and tomorrow. Shipping supply chains, I mean, just tons and tons of disruption. At the same time, customer behavior is becoming much more fragmented. Consumers are engaging across more than 10 channels on average. And we find increasingly that no single executive or function owns the customer anymore. And this makes it really hard to deliver consistent growth. But we know how important delivering growth is for investors, for shareholders. And so there's a bit of this temptation in moments like this, a disruption, to focus on efficiencies and productivity and cost. And while those things are important, we know they can't come at the expense of also focusing on growth. And so we really try to reemphasize that through this research, that now is the time to do both. And growth is still going to be the most important thing over the long run.
Great. Okay. So growth, you're saying it's, always vital, but tougher than ever to sustain in this current complex climate. What did the research tell us about the role of the CMO specifically in this growth calculus, this growth equation? Kelsey?
Yeah. So I think, we actually did this research because we believe and we know that whether you call it a CMO or in some companies, it might be a customer officer or CCO, this idea of someone who's looking out for sustainable, profitable growth with the consumer or the customer at the center is vital. And when we see marketing leaders embedded in more strategic decision making, not just being a brand or a communications officer, but actually taking responsibility for kind of that customer-centric growth strategy, we know that companies perform better, right? And so we actually we're able to kind of take what we see in the organization and correlate that to performance, right? And make a case for why is it important to have someone who has that role, a CMO who is empowered, who sits at the right table. And what we saw is when companies had marketing execs involved in strategic planning, you see 1.4x higher top line. And when you actually have a single integrated kind of customer-centric exec that's on the top team, you see 2.3x the growth, right? So the growth equation is very clear, and the need for that executive is very clear. I think the challenge we're seeing play out is that from an organizational point of view, because of what Shelley mentioned on the complexity of journeys, we've seen a big proliferation of roles on C-suite, on exec teams. So if we look back 5 years, for example, the size of an executive team has increased 50%, right? And so what that means is we've added all these great roles: chief digital officer, chief data officer, chief revenue officer, sometimes a CCO, and sometimes all of those roles alongside of a CMO. But what that means is there really isn't one person who's kind of thinking end to end about that strategic growth for customer acquisition or retention. And so kind of the way we think about it is when everyone is responsible for that, no one really is, right? It's kind of been fragmented.
Right. That's super interesting. Okay, I want to get a little bit more into that point. So based on our research, having this kind of single integrative role in the C-suite offers this opportunity for growth that's both realistic and actually sounds like potentially within reach. So say a little bit more about what's driving the disconnect in the C-suite, this disconnect between CEOs and CMOs. Shelley, do you want to take that?
Yeah, absolutely, Lucia. Look, there's no doubt from my conversations, both at Can Lion, but also in general with my clients, that there is a real disconnect. And our data suggests that disconnect is growing. So by one measure, and we've been tracking this over time, we found that the gap between the CEO and the CMO has grown by 20%. Again, at this time, that is super critical to really focus on and deliver growth. And Kelsey alluded to this, but only 50% of CMOs are involved in strategic planning alongside the CEO. I mean, that's a startling statistic in a world where I think of the CMO as being someone who really does understand the end-to-end customer journey. And so that lack of alignment really creates issues. The other evolution talked about is marketing has gotten more complex as the customer fragmentation has increased, as performance marketing has gotten more complicated, more ways to do it, more different metrics for measurement. And we asked this question of whether CEOs understand modern marketing, and 65% of CEOs said they're confident. only 70% of CMOs actually believe the CEOs understand modern marketing. And so that's a really troubling thing. And again, at a time when CEOs are grappling with all sorts of other issues. And so, again, it gets back to this point of disconnect that really is to the detriment of the customer and growth.
Okay. And let's bring in that sort of third leg in the triad we've been talking about in the research, the CFO. Kelsey, talk to us a little bit more explicitly about where and how the CFO fits into this axis and why alignment among all three of these roles is both so vital and, again, so challenging.
Yeah, so this year we talked to executives at over 100 of like the largest global companies. We increasingly added the CFO to that discussion, right? Right to your question, Lucia, because it is really that kind of trio that we think is important to unlock the growth potential we're talking about, right? And the CEO CMO relationship is something we've studied for the last few years. The CFO is also critical in that room, talking about, okay, well, how do we think about resource allocation? How do we think about investment, right? And that's critical as we think about the job and the kind of the steward as a CMO from a customer and consumer perspective. And I think the real question for that group is, what is marketing driving for the business? Like what is the outcome that we see from all the marketing activity that we do? And I, spend many of my days with the CMOs and the other roles, but a lot of CMOs in my role. And, I think in many cases, there isn't complete trust and alignment in answering that question. And, one interesting stat is we asked the CEOs and the CMOs, we will ask the CFOs next year, but I'm pretty sure it'll be the same stat. Did they think that marketing was underfunded as a discipline? 80% of CEOs and almost 80%, about 77% of CMOs said yes. Marketing for my company is underfunded. But then if you look over the last year, the actual dollars going to marketing decreased from 9.1 to 7.7% of sales on average. And so clearly there's this kind of disconnect between the aspiration for how we want to fund the discipline and the growth we want to see, but then the dollars that are really going towards it. And to us, that underscores the need for the involvement of the CFO. And then, the stats you see on this page were also really, really telling, we think, from the research this year. 70% of CEOs told us that part of how they assess marketing's impact is year-on-year revenue or margin growth. So that's part of, it might not be the only thing they use to gauge marketing's impact, but that is part of how they viewed it. But only 35% of CMOs had that on their list, right? When we asked, how do you kind of view how you communicate? And so that disconnect right there. And I think a lot of CMOs would say, well, we don't own the whole P&L. We can get into that in some of the Q&A maybe. But that lack of alignment, I think, really shows the challenge that a lot of companies are having. It's a really big problem.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, that's a pretty clear misalignment. Both of you are veterans of this McKinsey Live program. And as you may remember, our audience tends to be super focused on the how to enable change and positive impact. So tell us, what needs to happen, practically speaking, for business leaders to begin to address this misalignment and bridge this C-suite gap? Shelley, do you want to take that?
Absolutely. And Kelsey and I are on a singular mission to bring the CMOs back. And that's what this starts with. We feel as though CMOs, genuinely great ones, know what drives growth, but they're often stuck in this gap between insight and execution. Sometimes the role's too tactical, but we think there's a clear opportunity. And so there's three things that we've highlighted. One is give marketing custody of the customer. So let marketing really own the customer journey and be that single point that feeds to the rest of the organization, feeds to product development, feeds to the sales organization. Two, adopt that general manager mindset. You may not have a P&L in your organization as a marketer, but what are the interlocks you have with the people who do have P&Ls, and how do you ensure that the way that you are judging yourself and being judged by the organization is based on those financial returns of the business? And then 3, tied to that, we're working through the C-suite with the CEO, with the CFO to come up with a measurement system that really aligns the activities to the kinds of outcomes that the business cares about, which is ultimately growth. And so if I kind of just get a little bit more into giving marketing custody of the customer, again, this is really about having one part of the organization that really owns end-to-end the customer journey, really has that deep level of insight of who are our customers today, who are our potential customers, what do they care about, what do they need, where do they buy, how do we touch and engage them? And then they are then feeding all of those insights to other parts of the organization. And that's really, really key, because if that sits in 5 or 6 different functions, you may have the insights in total, but they never get integrated in a way that allows you to be most effective. And so again, that always is to the detriment of growth. I think one of the other things, which is a bit of a trend, and Kelsey also alluded a bit to this, is we need to move away from the misconception of marketing as a cost function. And often when times are tough, when there's lots of either distraction in the external world or real cost pressure that an institution faces, instinctively they may go to slash the marketing budget. But slashing the marketing budget may save you dollars in the near term, but it will cost you growth, assuming that you have a marketing organization that's high performing. Because when done well, it of course drives revenue. It helps you attract new customers, keep customers, increase the customer lifetime value. And so this whole idea of getting marketing back at the core, back with a seat at the table, back involved in the strategic design articulation of the business, that will ensure that you're meeting the needs of the customers, and that will fuel long-term growth.
Makes sense. Okay. So I think I'm hearing then that there needs to be education, maybe also a mindset shift if CMOs are to become that single or at least the foremost leader advocating on behalf of an organization's customers, taking custody for the customers as you've described. Kelsey, can I get your thoughts here?
Yeah. We see, I mentioned the CEO kind of thinking around what does success and accountability look like for marketing, right? The 70-35 gap. We do acknowledge that these executives typically have kind of rose to the C-suite through very different paths. And so that's part of, a CEO and the CFOs have typically been general managers, have typically been P&L owners, or accountable for tracking all of that in the case of the CFO and really enabling that, right? We saw in our research, like 9 out of 10 CEOs don't have a marketing background. So that's kind of where you're starting, right? And likewise, from a CMO perspective, the CMOs have not grown up in that general manager mindset. And so what we mean by this second action is, as the CMO, there is, an onus on you to actually go and kind of hook into the chassis of the kind of financial goals and the strategic goals and the business unit goals in a much more integrated way, right? So if you're a CMO and you're waking up with more of a general manager mindset, you are thinking about what are the near and medium term goals for every one of the businesses I support or the products I support? How to kind of the day-to-day activities in my team enable those, right? How do I then communicate to the other parts of the organization what I'm doing on behalf of those goals? And while I might not own the whole P&L, how can I communicate the component that I am really driving, right? And where I might need help on other pieces of it. And so it's really about this more holistic, business-centric mindset. And also making sure that their teams are showing up that way, collaborating with their cross-functional teams as well. And so I think we acknowledge there's a little bit of a gap educationally and role-wise, and I think it puts a higher bar in the CMO to really kind of, speak in a way and act in a way that's going to enable that CEO-CFO bridge.
Makes sense. Okay, let's take this third step. Suppose I'm a CMO, I'm listening to this, I'm in violent agreement, but we all know that measuring the impact of marketing initiatives is like notoriously difficult. How do I get started on communicating to my CXO colleagues how I'm performing in delivering these strategic outcomes?
Yeah, and Lucia, you're right. It's really hard, right? So when we say, third step is a measurement system, we say that acknowledging that creating that is actually really difficult. I think our observation is over the last 10 to 15 years, you've had, a huge growth in very measurable, very kind of direct response marketing. And what that means is, the CFO, I think, gets excited and comfortable around, okay, I can put this many dollars in and quickly see the outcome, right? But that doesn't keep kind of a healthy cross funnel, cross customer business, right? And so I think a lot of the challenge that these companies and our clients have run into is how do I kind of prove and align on what I'm trying to drive? And that's not just direct sales right now, but it's also cultivating kind of the short, medium, and long-term health of the business. And this is something you have to do in that trio we talked about, right? Like you have to have all three of those execs really aligned on what do we mean by this, right? I think the best way to bring it to life is actually talking to one of the features we had in the research itself. So we asked the CMO of GM, Norm DeGrev, and we asked a couple other execs there to talk to us about, as he came in, kind of what did it look like for marketing to kind of reestablish itself, right? And you can read it more in the research, but I'll give the highlights. I think, there were really three things that he did as he came in. One, he actually developed that measurement framework and said, hey, there's going to be everything from top to bottom of the funnel metrics. We're going to have what he called fast twitch metrics, and then we're going to have customer lifetime value metrics. Let's all align on how we define these, which ones are most important, how we make trade-offs across them, and also the fact that we care about all of them. We don't just care about the fast twitch money now. That's an important piece, right? Second thing he did was they support a holistic portfolio of brands. I'm sure many folks on the call support different business units, different brands, and aligned on how do we think about an allocation approach across this portfolio? How do we really think about how we're smart about trading dollars between one sub brand and the next, right? And then lastly, he established a cadence with his CFO and the broader leadership team, right? So kind of the ongoing dialogue, the ability to live into making decisions based on points 1 and 2. And that really reset it, right? And I think you've seen, strong year-on-year growth there and, real success on some of their primary objectives on EVs too. So I think that's one great example in real life.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Okay, we have had a ton of audience engagement today, so I want to get to some questions. Again, a lot of interest in how, and just thinking very tactically in a brass tacks way, what is one piece of practical advice you would give to a CMO and a CEO just to get started? Anything you've seen particularly well in helping to accelerate bridging that divide that we've been discussing? And I'll throw that out. Either one of you can take it.
I can start. I think step one would be sit down, and if it's a one-on-one or I don't know who else, depends on the teams who you want in the room, have the discussion on what is the goal of marketing and what metrics do I think I as a CMO and I as a CEO or CFO think should be held accountable. The first draft's not going to be right, but actually just sit down and start to have that conversation. What are we measuring? What are my goals? How does that tie to the P&L? And if as a CMO, you actually proactively ask for that, you've already changed the dynamic in most companies around, how am I coming to the table and how am I trying to making sure that my function is accountable? So that would be my first step.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I think another flavor of that is everyone cares about the customer. It doesn't matter what business you're in. But I think forcing the discussion around where does custody of the customer sit today, and actually getting the top team aligned around where are the different places where it sits, and putting that in front of everyone and said, how can we have an integrated view if it sits across all of these places? And you as a CMO, you don't have to make that conversation about you, but you make it about the customer and making clear that right now it likely sits across a bunch of different places. And so even that level of transparency at a minimum will force a very good discussion that I hope all stakeholders can be aligned on, which is, well, hey, we need a more integrated view of the customer if we're going to win in this market.
Yeah, Shelley, actually that's a nice answer too to another of the questions that came in on like resistance from the CEO to concede ownership of the customer to the CMO and how to navigate that. I think you covered that pretty well there. Couple of questions on talent. Many CMOs don't have a P&L background, as the two of you mentioned, and lots of CEOs may think or say that they understand modern marketing, but don't necessarily have a marketing background. That's part of the divide we've been discussing. So how to think about talent in that particular element of the CMO CEO divide?
Yeah, I think so. I can start on this one too. I think one way, I think it starts at the top. So the CMO, I think question one is, how do you bridge the gap at the education level at the very top? And we've talked a little bit about that. The metrics conversation is helpful. Frankly, I think ideally there is trust in that relationship. I know many of my clients, there is trust, and those execs, the CEO, CFO, CMO are there to all deliver a great performance for the company. And so I think I would say even just an honest conversation around, hey, there's a lot changing in marketing, right? You could even use us as an excuse. I just saw this interesting report post Cannes Lions from McKinsey, or, I'm sure there are one or two others you've received. I'd love to talk a little bit about how it's evolving and the pieces that I think are most important for our business. Would you be up for that for 45 minutes? That already kind of starts to, I think, bridge the gap there. And then I think, the CEO or the CFO could actually say, hey, we should sit down and really have a deep dive session on kind of the objectives by business unit overall, what we want the shape of the P&L to look like, and welcoming that kind of in the reverse direction too. Now, any of those folks can instigate those too. And then I think there's a question on talent below the C-suite, right? Which is, how do you cultivate and make sure that, I would say it's very important that marketers who show up every morning actually are thinking, what did I do to drive the business forward today? And I don't think marketers and executional marketers or marketing managers or creative directors are often asked that question. Like, what did you do when you woke up and you came to work? What did you do to drive the success of this business forward today? And what's the tangible example or the quantitative example, or even last week, right? So I think there's some of the kind of talent below and really pushing them on their mindset that's important too.
Anything to add, Shelley?
Well, that was good.
Okay, so we're closing in on time. A person after my own heart here has asked for more scuttlebutt from Cannes. Any themes you heard emerging, particularly around the topic of Gen AI and now even agentic AI, which has particular ramifications for creative work such as marketing?
I would say, go ahead, Shelley. You go first.
No, for sure. So I think that the first thing I would just say, Lucia, is this whole idea of navigating through disruption as the new norm was obviously the macro theme, and a recognition that you don't have the luxury to wait and see, right? So you have to be moving proactively to turn disruption into opportunity. And I think that was a theme. That's been a theme at a few of these conferences that I've been at. On the topic of AI and agentic AI, I think so much there. Folks are talking about how it's going to reshape marketing organizations, and in terms of what the makeup and the skill sets are that are required. But I think the big thing for me was a recognition in marketing, but really across all functions, that the organizations that win are going to be the organizations where people plus agents are working hand in hand, right? And by the way, the scary thing, which I heard, is that's not just humans asking agents to do tasks. It will be agents also asking humans to do tasks. But my point is a recognition that you have to embrace this technology, and it's not about agents replacing people. It's going to be the organizations where humans master agentic AI and are therefore then able to kind of leapfrog their peers. And so that was definitely a topic of discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Kelsey?
Yeah, I think we know that there's, of the disciplines where AI is going to have the most impact, marketing is one of the top three, right? So you think technology, you think customer service, you think marketing typically, right? We did an MGI report on this. And so there's huge potential. I think at Cannes, you heard a lot about the kind of cost and kind of speed components of examples where it has started to really change the game for some companies. I think there was a big shift from pilot to reimagining domains. So from, hey, we did a pilot, we proved we could do this campaign a lot quicker, to how do we take the entire creative process and rewire it front to end? And that's not just about a tool. That's about like reassessing every process step or every workflow. There's a ton of change management in that. Is not just about, here you go, you've got, pick your favorite creative AI tool. So I think that was a big conversation. And then I think on agentic, there was a little bit of acknowledgement of exactly what Shelley said, is like, the world is going to fundamentally change. How are we going to maintain the creativity and the inspiration and the role of, all of that? And it is what Shelley described, which is it has to be a human and answer, right? And how do we embrace agentic as a way to help us, find time efficiencies and reallocate that time, versus fearing that the marketing ecosystem is going to dissolve, which, like, there are some articles out there that are very pointed around what that future looks like. And I think most of the folks at Cannes felt like that isn't necessarily the outcome, but we've got to work to make sure that that's not the outcome.
Super interesting time. Okay, unfortunately, that brings us to our close. This was a fantastic discussion, Shelley and Kelsey. Thanks again for being together with all of us today.
Thank you, Lucia.
And as always, many thanks to all of you in our McKinsey Live audience. You will be able to find a replay of this and previous McKinsey Live events, as well as more of our research on the power of the CEO, CMO, CFO partnership, and also on agentic AI. We've just published a couple of interesting pieces of research on that as well on our website, mckinsey.com. And be sure to join us in July for our next event on the top tech trends to watch, speaking of AI and what they could mean for all of us. This is a major piece of research for us every year. And these rapid advances we've seen over the past year are sure to make it super interesting and provocative. We'll be in discussion with a couple of our foremost leaders and experts on this, Lorena Yee and Michael Chewy, who are both lead authors on this research. So see you there. Have a great day or evening and be well.